Okay. Hi, Dorian. Thanks for joining. Good morning.
Hello.
All right, Irene, let us know whenever you're ready and we can get started.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, great. Well, we have a small meeting this morning. It's just the two of you on the subcommittee. Emily might be able to join the second hour, but we're not sure yet. And Caleb and I will be walking us through this meeting. So let's see. Caleb, do you want to share screen?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, so if you can go back to the first screen. Welcome, everybody. This is a Land Use Governance and Sovereignty Subcommittee meeting of the California Agricultural Land Equity Task Force. We have the next 2 hours together. We may or may not use all of that time. And I see that we have a couple of members of the public, so welcome. And we are at quorum. We have 2 out of 3 members of this subcommittee with us today. So you can go to the next slide, Caleb. A couple of participation guidelines, which I know most of you have seen before. So we're here to share, listen, and learn. We want to encourage everyone to respect different perspectives, a difference of opinions, and generate a good, lively dialogue. We ask that everyone try to stay on point. We have a lot of different subcommittees, and as the members know, while all the topics are very connected and overlapping, we do try to focus on specific topic areas in each of those subcommittees. So today, this subcommittee is focusing on land use governance and sovereignty. And so, yeah, we ask everyone to keep their public comments to the topics at hand. You can move on, Caleb. So Zoom tips, again, most of you folks have seen this before. Everyone is muted upon entry, or all members of the public, I should say. Task force members, we encourage you all to be off mute on camera to the extent you are comfortable. And feel free to, jump in freely and engage in the conversation. You can use the raise your hand feature when making public comment, and you can also fill out our public comment form online. Go on to the next screen. So here's our agenda for the day. We are going to start out with an approval of the meeting summary from September 17th. And then the bulk of the meeting will be a working session where Caleb will start us out with a staff update. We will review some of the content that is in the working group document. Then we'll discuss some preliminary recommendations relevant to this subcommittee. We'll walk through some of those. And then we'll close out with action items and the next steps. And then we'll have general public comment. So you can go to the next slide. Roll call. So I'm gonna call out your name and please just say here or I. Member Dorian Payan.
Here.
Member Irene de Barriqua.
Here.
Wonderful, welcome. Okay. And then member Emily Bergano is absent. Okay, we're gonna start with the approval of the summary. We sent that out in advance. Just wanna pause for a moment to see if there's any requested revisions from the members of the subcommittee. None. Okay. I'm gonna pause to see if there's any public comment about the meeting summary. So you can raise your hand or you can can complete the form at sgc.ca.gov/meetings-events. I'm not seeing any online public comments. So I think we are good. If one of the subcommittee members can make a motion to approve the meeting summary from September 17th. And then the other one will second it.
So I can approve?
Go ahead. Yeah, do you want to make a motion? You can just say, I make a motion to approve the meeting summary.
I make the motion to approve the meeting summary.
Wonderful. Dorian, do you second?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, and then I think this is just a formality, but we'll go around just calling the members' names, and then you can say aye to express your approval. So Irene de Barriqua, do you approve?
Aye.
Thank you. And Dorian Fayan, do you approve?
Aye.
Okay.
I'm getting married.
Yeah, I'm filling in for Megan here, so she is probably a little more smooth with that process, but that's okay. Okay, we can move on. Thank you for walking through that. So yeah, we're going to get into our working session. This will be the bulk of the meeting. You can go to the next slide, Caleb, and I think I'm just going to hand it over to you to start us out with some staff updates.
Yeah, so the rest of the meeting is pretty much just going to be working session. I'll provide some staff updates, and then we'll do some more discussion-based work throughout the rest of the meeting. So first, regarding some guest speakers, staff have been in contact with the Circle Law Group, and we are working on finding a time for them to present to this subcommittee and perhaps invite the broader task force to hear from them as well. So we are working on finding a time for that. It will probably be in late February or early March. We are also working on finding a time to hear from a representative of the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. And then we also heard a request in the last subcommittee meeting to hear from perhaps the program administrator of CNRA's, California Natural Resource Agency's Tribal Nature-Based Solutions Program. The Grants and Resources Subcommittee, though, is conducting some research on various state level and one federal level programs. And this is one of the programs that the Grants and Resources Subcommittee is looking into. So what staff propose is waiting for that research to be finalized and conducted, and then sharing the results of that research with this subcommittee and kind of assessing next steps from there. So I'll pause here to see if that sounds good, or if there are any questions or concerns with these ideas or that process.
Sounds good.
Great.
Yeah, ditto.
Great. Move on then. So there's a lot of text on this slide, and I apologize for that. We have kind of a newer update for you. This has kind of been spearheaded by Camille, who's not able to be with us today. So Tessa and I will do our best to answer questions, but just kind of noting at the forefront that there may be some additional questions that you have that we'll need to take back to some of the other staff members, and we can get back to you with answers to your questions at a later date. But Dr. Greg Macy from the UC Irvine Law Center for Land, Environment, and Natural Resources is working with a team of environmental law researchers to examine local land use planning and how that intersects or affects climate action. Their work is funded by the California State Legislature. And the work that they're doing is they are creating some policy briefs to assist various entities in advancing kind of climate action goals, particularly regarding local land use planning. These entities have been identified to be primarily local governments, but they are excited by the work that the task force is doing and want to help out with the task force in whatever way they can. And so they're proposing kind of shifting their work a bit to kind of help assist or bolster the work of the task force. So the proposal that they are kind of bringing to us is to meet with identified task force members, and we're proposing that those identified task force members be this subcommittee and perhaps one other subcommittee. And they'll meet with the task force members and staff to identify questions related to land use policies and regulations and how they impact equitable agricultural land access. Based on that conversation, they would conduct research and write a policy brief draft. After that policy brief draft is written, they would host a half-day workshop to discuss the draft and refine it. And then they would present a final brief to the task force for the task force's consideration and potential conclusion in the recommendations or final report, if or as relevant. Ultimately, the goal is to supplement the task force's processing goals and kind of provide an additional set of research capabilities to help inform the report. So I know that's a lot, but kind of our general question is whether you guys think this is valuable, and if you have any thoughts on scope, goals, or the process.
I think it sounds good.
Great.
I don't know for you.
Yeah, I think this would be a great subcommittee for that. This looks great.
Great. Tessa, is there anything you'd like to add or any other questions?
No, I mean, I think, it sounds like the subcommittee members are interested in the opportunity, maybe just kind of like high level to point out a couple things. So this would be a kind of an intensified process of what we're doing at a larger scale. So, the process that you all are going through in each subcommittee and then in quarterly meetings is taking these ideas, kind of workshopping them into well-articulated recommendations. And so this team would be helping this subcommittee and maybe a couple other subcommittee members or members of a couple other subcommittees do this in a really concentrated way for the topics that Caleb was talking about. And so it would, require maybe a couple extra hours of work, either within this subcommittee or outside of the subcommittee, and then that potential kind of final review of the brief and follow-up conversations. So just kind of noting that it's sounds like a really valuable opportunity and may require a couple extra hours of work as part of this subcommittee. So.
Irene, I see you're unmuted. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we move on?
No, thanks.
Okay, just wanted to check. So I'll go ahead and move on then. So regarding the working group document, there's been a lot of work done in that. And so thank you, Dorian, for the work that you've done in there. A lot of the upcoming staff updates are going to be based on the work of that was done in that working group document, and even some of our discussions will be based on some of the ideas and language proposed in that working group document. So just want to kind of recognize that at the outset. But one of the research requests that we heard or noticed was to kind of hear or learn more about what municipalities are doing to integrate urban agriculture definitions or priorities into their general plans. And so staff have actually identified a general plan database that kind of allows for this research and or analysis to be done. And so we will share that with you guys in the recap email that Megan sends out with the meeting summary. And we can also propose this kind of research request to a member of the advisory committee that we are in the process of standing up. So I guess I'll pause here to see if that conversation would be valuable, if we'd like to have a conversation with a member of the advisory committee, or if there are kind of other ideas kind of regarding this specific research request. Okay, seeing none, and please feel free to stop me at any time. There was also an expressed interest to look into the Department of Conservation's Farmland Conservancy Program. So similar to the CNRA program that I mentioned earlier, this program is also being researched by the Grants and Resources Subcommittee and the work that's being done there. So again, our proposal is to bring that research back to this subcommittee, share the updates and findings that we find on that program with you all before doing kind of any additional research beyond that. And then there was also some discussion of Governor Newsom's statement of administration policy as it relates to Native American ancestral lands. This policy has a lot of language regarding ancestral land return. And kind of because of that, we think that this would be more appropriate for the Land Access, Acquisition, and Ancestral Land Return, LA3 subcommittee to dive into and work on. So that's our proposal to this subcommittee. Again, I'll just pause for any quick reactions or feedback. Okay, seeing none. There was also some discussion of cultural fire management. So this work is currently being done in the Sustaining Natural and Cultural Resources Subcommittee. And so with the programs that we have listed here that were identified in the working group document, our proposal is to keep this work with the Sustaining Natural and Cultural Resources Subcommittee. But we are happy to have, if a member of this subcommittee would like to work with a member of the Sustaining and Natural Cultural Resources Subcommittee to perhaps establish a working group to kind of dive into these policies and programs in this issue further, we would be happy to do that. So I'll see if there's any initial interest in that, and it's always something that we can come back to as well.
I can share that I'd have interest in that in particular. I think it would relate to the subcommittee as we think of the governance pieces related to cultural burning and cultural burning in particular. Just how those government to government relationships are being formed or co-government agreements in general. So yeah, I think it's great that it's being held in that subcommittee, but if it comes to in parts of this that relate particularly to sovereignty and how that interfaces with being able to steward land in a culturally affirming way, I would want to be a part of that.
Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. Would you like to, or perhaps would you be willing for us to take this proposal to the SNCR subcommittee and see if one of them would be willing to join kind of a working group with you on this issue?
Yeah, I think that works.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And so Caleb, you've added a couple of details here. So this is a task force and a couple of bills. I believe these were from the working group document, right?
Yeah.
So curious if, Dorian, there was anything else to say about this framework here, or if you would add anything as we do, potentially shape up a working group or bring this conversation to SNCR.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I mean, I think these are three. I mean, these three pieces are what I identified as currently existing that we can build on. So, hmm. Yeah, I guess I wouldn't know what to add to that. I just know that, yeah, these are sort of I think certain ways that policy is already reflecting the need for added language for cultural burning.
Okay. So maybe a starting place for where we can add language. And then the SNCR subcommittee had pointed to, or had kind of requested an overview of the regulatory framework that currently shapes largely prescribed fire and then how that can limit cultural fire. So if that aligns with kind of what you're thinking about, we can, I think, take these three pieces of the current framework and merge it with that work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as it relates, if I'm not mistaken, I think SB 926, I know that it was language around the prescribed fire liability program. It actually increased language in the legislature to make cultural burns. It sort of it created language for cultural burns to maybe just exist more directly. So that's also a good place to start from. That language has been added as a result of that legislature.
Wonderful. Thanks for that context.
Yeah, that's helpful to know. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to the next part of kind of the working session. So as I mentioned earlier, kind of our goal for this meeting is to be able to kind of talk through some proposed draft language for your guys' review and feedback. And so one of the kind of issues or pieces of language talked about frequently during the kind of breakout sessions during the second day of the November meeting at the kind of guiding principles table with Camille was defining sovereignty. And that conversation got elevated to kind of the full task force level during our apologies for the team's notifications. But that conversation got elevated to our to kind of the full task force level. And so our hope is to kind of walk through what, based on those conversations and discussions, what staff have kind of developed as an initial draft for kind of attempting to define sovereignty. So I would like to take some time to have you both kind of review this language up on the screen. And we take a couple of minutes to review that, and then we can have, or we'll have space for kind of an initial idea, larger feedback moment on this proposed definition. And then we can also go kind of line by line into some of this language for review. So if that sounds good, take a couple of minutes just to kind of read through and kind of sit with this and think about this language. Okay, looks like we might be ready to start up again. So I'm going to exit out of full screen sharing, so bear with me for 1 second. Okay. So what I think we can do is if we have any ideas or kind of proposed larger feedback on that language, and I am happy to toggle back and forth between the language as well, if that might be helpful. But first, just any general feedback, thoughts, ideas, maybe at the broader level, not quite at the kind of line by line level.
So this is line by line we're talking here.
We can jump to line by line, if that might be helpful. We can move on to, if there kind of aren't more of those like broader ideas, we can jump to kind of some of the more line by line review and revision.
Oh, I think we can start in general. I think I would add, and maybe, yeah, this is something I would want to just put on here for us to discuss further. But I think the idea of responsibility comes up that I think hasn't really been interpreted in this definition of sovereignty.
Can you elaborate a bit more?
Right. So I think we focus on control and like being able to acknowledge the agency and the control that maybe a group or a nation will have. But I think in particular, especially with like non-tribal groups, I think it's really moving away from that fiat of like we call the shots, but like also really being like sovereignty is only possible if you share the responsibility for the greater good of the land. And I think so just being able to make the sovereignty um, mutually dependent on the idea of responsibility versus like the idea of like fiat, of like having sovereignty for the sake of having sovereignty.
Yes. Great. Any other broader level thoughts, ideas, or feedback?
I'll add one more, and maybe this is already being covered with the fact that we added decision making into the definition. But I think there is something that I also want to highlight about process, especially as we develop, we're developing policy recommendations that are going to take further input from communities that are hopefully wanting to develop sovereignty on the land. And so I think, from point A, the sort of from point A, the beginning, like the recommendations to point C, where hopefully there's sovereignty. There's a point B, which is like the process, right? And the process also has to respect the sovereignty as well. So I think there's something in there around process that I want to really want to articulate, but I'm not quite sure yet how to do it. But I'm just thinking of like the way that we reach to a place where we all feel like we can exercise sovereignty also has to have those components in place. So, like sort of process versus results.
Great. We can always jump back to this kind of broader level ideas as well, but perhaps it might be helpful then to move on to some of more line by line review and feedback. So I think we'll just start here. Is there kind of anything in here that kind of jumps out to you as potentially needing revision or addition?
This feels good to me. I don't know if Aiden has anything. I also wish Emily was here. She's a great wordsmith.
Yes.
An important note too that obviously Emily is an important part of this subcommittee, and given that she wasn't able to be here today, we definitely will bring everything discussed today back to her, probably in like a one-on-one conversation. So Irene and Dorian, just to let you know.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think it looks good. I'm more in my mind just thinking out loud. I'm trying to like analyze the difference with autonomy and sovereignty and if there needs to be more clarification on that. But I think it sounds good. Looks good.
Sorry, Irene, could you repeat that kind of the distinction or connection between what and sovereignty? Do you say economy?
Autonomy?
Autonomy. Okay.
Sovereignty?
And Irene, when you think about autonomy, is this definition aligning with that, or is there something that you would add or feel like the definition of autonomy would have that this definition might not?
Sorry, I'm trying to like look at the slide, but this is the whole definition right here. What you've copied and pasted above.
Caleb, maybe go back to the full definition. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it doesn't really apply. I think I'm just in my own mind, I'm just thinking the difference because it's talking about land equity requires stability, autonomy, and sovereignty, but I guess we're only defining sovereignty here.
Do you think it's important to kind of set out a different definition for autonomy?
That's what I was wondering. I'm not sure. I'm not really.
Yeah, I appreciate that distinction. I think it does evoke something different when I think of autonomy and sovereignty. So maybe sovereignty feels like it has more of a relationship piece attached to it, versus autonomy feels like it has more of an independence piece to it. That's just, I think, Irene, as I hear you, I'm wondering if like that's something that resonates with you too, because that's when I see them side by side, I'm like, okay, I do see something different there. I mean, I think they're of
Yeah,
course tied together, but yeah.
yeah, thanks, Dorian. That's what I'm more curious, right? Because I understand them a little differently, but I'm not really an expert on what each of them would mean at a larger scale. So I think, and I think at one point there was a discussion about like true autonomy. It had more to do with land trusts and stuff that I think were really good points, that there wasn't really true autonomy. Um,
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Staff can kind of spend some time thinking on this as well, and perhaps propose something uh, that kind of outlines this distinction between autonomy and sovereignty. So I think we can move on to this second part of that definition and see if there are any kind of initial uh, feedback or revisions on this portion of that kind of broader definition that was proposed. Not seeing anything, would you like to move on to the next portion?
Maybe I can add one thing, and I like this definition, especially as it's um, encapsulated in the larger definition of land equity. But I'm thinking of, especially as it relates to California tribal nation sovereignty. I mean, I'm just, thinking like the whole of California is native land. And so I think there's a sort of, I think I would want to articulate something around the idea of like, it's not two different types of sovereignty and, we're maybe choosing between one or the other, but I feel like foundational is like starting with California tribal nation sovereignty. Um, And maybe this is something that, yeah, we can put up for discussion, but I just feel like that feels like a foundational piece, especially as we're thinking of equity and reparation, to acknowledge that.
Great. I'll move on to the third and final kind of chunk of that definition. Again, for your kind of review or feedback.
Yeah, I think similar. I added this in the general notes, but I think adding along with this and a process that is reflective of that. So I think there's the idea of, the critical component is autonomy over land use and decision making, and yeah, along with a process that is reflective of that, so that the process itself is reflective of the exercise of sovereignty.
And you already mentioned this too, Dorian, but to your comment about sovereignty meaning being mutually dependent on care and responsibility as much as control and agency, I'm wondering if either here or in the first section of the definition, that might be a good place to add those additional. So that's, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a question for you, where you think that should go.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, I think it could be added here. Yeah, could we look at the first one really quick, just so that I can.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe the first one actually feels more relevant.
Dorian and or Tessa, can you repeat that language? Because I thought it was said quite well when I captured that in notes.
Go ahead, Dorian, or I'm happy to repeat what I just said. I don't want to speak
Yeah.
for you.
No, I like how you captured it.
So it was something along the lines of sovereignty being mutually dependent on care and responsibility and not just control. And so, yeah, I guess probably to not wordsmith down to the period right now, we can, integrate that and then bring it back for the meeting. Okay.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
Jump back to the third section. But I'll also add that if there is, as you've gone through this, if there are any kind of, again, if you want to jump back to the kind of broader points, ideas, happy to add stuff there as well. We can maybe spend a minute or two more just kind of think about any final revisions before moving on to kind of the next section of the meeting.
So another question I might just float to see what Dorian and Irene are thinking about this is around the definition, which is broken into two parts. So if maybe go back to that slide 13, where we have the 1 and 2. So I think that kind of came out of the discussion that Camille was leading at the last quarterly meeting in the context of sovereignty meaning different things for tribal nations and then for other communities that are also on the land. And so Dorian, to your point that we're kind of starting with California tribal nations and sovereignty for them, I'm wondering if there's anything more to say about this point number 2 or how we want to contextualize that, or, does it need to be kind of updated or changed at all in that context?
I don't see them clashing. I think, yeah, what I wanted to emphasize in the first one was the idea that it's these sovereignties shouldn't be oppositional.
Mhm.
And I think as long as we're able to express that, just so that, especially as for the purposes of developing legislature and advancing land equity, we don't see an either or. And I think there's a space for us to understand that starting from a place of like this being native land, and that subsequent forms of sovereignty or simultaneous forms of sovereignty can exist in good relationship with California tribal sovereignty.
Great, thanks for adding that. And Irene, I know that you work with farm worker communities, and just curious if you want to share anything about, kind of what sovereignty means in that context, or if you have any reflections on this, number 2 part of the definition.
Um, yeah, I mean, I would think, I mean, it could be included, right? That those who have tended the land, well, in terms of the Bracero program and immigrant, but I would say definitely in the order that it's in here on number 2. But
Yeah, I don't mean to put you on the spot. If there's
Yeah.
nothing, if it looks good, that's great. Just wanted to kind of make a little bit of space for that.
yeah, I would have to think about that a little more. I don't know if it, but I know in some conversations, especially in terms of land access, like giving farm workers and especially those who have been here for 30 years working the land have some sort of priority in accessing land. But yeah, I think it's good how it is. I like it.
Great. And I'll just share that as we kind of move on from this, if you have any ideas that kind of come up after the meeting or a week from now, always feel free to send those ideas through an email to a staff member or throw them in a working group document. And we're happy to incorporate that feedback kind of when it comes to you as well. So, but with that, I think we'll move on unless there are any other kind of ideas or thoughts on this. And thank you both for walking through this language with us. Okay. So we're gonna shift gears here, and I'd like us to kind of think through easements and covenants a bit. This has been brought up quite frequently in kind of task force discussion. And so kind of outlining the plan, so you'll see there's not a lot of content on these upcoming slides here, but I think it would be helpful for us to maybe do some thought work on kind of the pros or the benefits that easements and covenants can provide, some of the cons or the issues that easements and covenants can create, and kind of then some ideal changes that we maybe like to see just initially with this kind of initial brainstorming section. And then we'll dive into Civil Code Section 815. That is the statute that kind of creates easements and covenants. And see if there's maybe some from that kind of brainstorming conversation, if there are any proposed ideas that we would like that we'd maybe like to see changed in this actually like in this statute, section 815. So if that sounds good, I was hoping we could maybe walk through some of the benefits that easements and covenants can provide. And I think this could just be a generative process, just throwing out kind of bullet points ideas of some of the pros of easements and covenants.
Awesome. So these are the pros. We're just kind of spitballing the pros. Or that? Okay, cool. I guess the first thing I will say is that they can be perpetual, which means that agreements and desires um, for how the land is stewarded can be safeguarded for future generations. So I think that's a good way to look at easements compared to things like leases or licenses. You know, they're able to withstand the test of time a little better.
Yeah. So I think kind of similar to that idea is they can also conserve agricultural land and kind of prevent its loss in a lot of ways. That seems accurate.
Yeah.
And then maybe also kind of building off of that, one of the benefits of kind of conserving this agricultural land is it ensures perhaps that development won't occur on that land into the future. So when the land does go up for sale, sometimes that land can be cheaper than it otherwise would be if that development option was an opportunity, perhaps making land a bit more accessible.
I'll also add one of the ways I've seen easements be useful is specifically with organizations that might not have the capacity to hold title to land, is that this allows them to have a relationship with land without maybe having all the financial responsibilities of holding title to the land. So I've seen this both with like shoestring ag groups, but also with like non-federally recognized tribes, for example, that are um, focusing in other parts of their tribal sovereignty.
Yeah. Cool. I think maybe then we can move on to some of the cons or issues that easements and covenants can or have created.
This one's going to be a little contentious, but I feel like it's created an incentives, sort of an incentives, maybe industry, I think, or I want to know how to say it, incentive scheme, maybe. I feel like easements are the first thing that existing landowners are offered in buying into equity, and maybe that's a conversation that stops shorter than it should. If that makes sense. Um, so yeah,
That second
and
bullet kind of highlight
oh,
that?
it does, yeah. It just because I think it encourages private landowners to um, reduce their tax burden with incentives versus like altogether thinking about what the relationship to that land should be as far as equity goes. And then I'll say that the fact that for the most part only 501c3 501c3s or tribal nations can hold them. I mean, I think it's great that tribal nations are included in the definition, but I think related to Irene's comment earlier on how we were talking about, how much autonomy exists when we're having to interface with land trusts. I think the fact that easements for the most part are only be able or can only be held by 501c3s. It can be a limitation.
Kind of building off of that autonomy limitation point, something that we've heard quite frequently in task force conversations is that easements and covenants can kind of restrict some of the actions that landowners might need to engage in order to be successful on the land, in order to live on the land, make a living on the land. That seems accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also related to that is the fact that when the easement gets drafted, if certain groups aren't in the discussions, then I feel like their vision for the land then isn't taken into consideration. So I'm just thinking about the Esalen tribe that we had speak the last time and how they took the land back with an easement stamped on it that wasn't reflective of their needs because they weren't in the discussions when the easement were created.
Okay, kind of based on that initial thought work, I'm curious if you guys have any ideas for what maybe an ideal easements and covenants landscape might look like, if we can maybe brainstorm that a bit.
might be good to kind of break this down or maybe just help facilitate some ideas in just to reflect what you all had just brainstormed. So maybe starting with who should be in the discussion when the easement is created. I think that was a point Dorian just made. You know, hearing from your comments, Dorian, the steward of the land should be in those conversations. What uses should be allowable. There's probably a lot to say about that, you know, because what uses should be allowable and where or on what portion of the land is maybe one framing. Maybe you all can just start there with those two questions. I might actually add one more point of context, and Caleb, feel free to jump in here. But you know, your work together as a subcommittee is to define some of these parameters, and you know, based on your experiences and what you've seen, sharing the ideal changes. So what could be improved? And another, so that can be kind of a first step. But another approach to all of our work as part of the task force is keeping in mind that a recommendation, a really valid and important recommendation, could also be just directing this work to be done. And so to the process point earlier, if this subcommittee and then the task force defines, you know, a set of parameters around what easements should look like, that's great. And then a parallel recommendation can also be, you know, explore this further or create a process to deepen this recommendation. So just keeping that in mind. We're doing this really important brainstorm right now and don't feel like that this is like the be all end all.
Yeah, thank you for that point, Tessa. I think it's something that I was relating back to. I'm just like, okay, I feel like it is a big process piece, so I'm glad that it's able to tie back to the initial piece on sovereignty that we were talking about. I'm trying to balance a way to create covenants or easements in general that are more impactful, but that don't necessarily create more administrative burden, or you know, if create some, not so much. So I think that's one thing that I'm like thinking of. But I do like the idea of best practices, or even just um yeah, feels redundant, but yeah, creating creating best practices that are more informed. To you know, I think Emily in one of our discussions brought the idea of like um, how to have cultural humility when engaging in these conversations. That's one thing that comes up for me.
So I think what might be helpful then is staff have collected kind of easements and covenants related recommendations or ideas that have been floated during task force discussion. So I think maybe like building off of this brainstorming session, maybe jumping to those and thinking through those ideas. And then maybe at the end, coming back to Civil Code Section 815, instead of going to Civil Code Section 815 now, I think that might maybe be a better flow. So we'll start here, which is amending Civil Code Section 815, so we'll skip that one. We will go here to these two recommendations. If you'd like to review these recommendations and provide any thoughts or feedback on these, again, these are proposed recommendations, proposed language, and really as the subcommittee, you guys could decide that you really like a recommendation or you like the idea behind a recommendation, but the language needs some refinement. Or you could even recommend or modify or suggest that this recommendation not move forward, or perhaps move forward in a different way. So kind of we'll leave that to you guys, and perhaps just give you a bit of time to kind of think through these two and provide your initial thoughts and feedback.
Sorry, I was curious on the other one of ideal changes, what the point Dorian was making on nonprofits being allowed to hold these. Should we add that to? But I don't know who who Dorian you think should it be small farmers or?
Yeah, that's a great. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. So.
Yeah, that's a great question because I think it goes back again to what we were just talking about right now related to best practices is that I feel like a lot of the maybe barriers that we're seeing are related to easements aren't necessarily how the statute is written, but it's really how culturally people are engaging with it. And I think there's a gap there. I think that we can sort of maybe put resources to in creating sort of the cultural infrastructure necessary. So like things for like um, training people how to have better conversations. Because I'm not sure that it would create a better solution for farmers themselves to hold the easements. I mean, I think there is a reason why I mean, I feel like the way the conservation easements are created around the conservation sort of land trust framework that we have for conserving land privately. So I'm not sure how that would increase the equity if farmers were to do it, it would actually not make a whole, well, I don't know. I can't think immediately of like the big difference that it would make on who would be holding the easement. But it's more like because the fact that 501c3s, nonprofits are the ones that are going to be holding the easements, they're usually the ones in the conversation. And so it comes down to like, if they're the ones in the conversation, then who are they bringing to the table and how are they showing up to the table? And so I think that's where I would want to maybe expand more on like, how do we develop different protocols so that Conservation Land Trust or whoever else they're partnering with have these relationships, right? That like speak to that sovereignty that we're talking about, that create a space where like that sovereignty is practiced, so that the easements that are being created are reflective of the vision of the land that people, or reflective of the vision people have for the land. Yeah, just a little, not really saying much as far as recommendation goes, but I think that's how I'm distinguishing it. So I guess that's why I was thinking, or yeah, I think it's good. Why? Yeah.
Yeah, more equitable process and more inclusive in terms of those 501c3s that are a part of these spaces, I guess, right? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Nice. Thank you.
And as you all might remember, in November, we were having conversations about conservation easements in multiple breakout groups, just because it's such a, important topic. It comes up in all the conversations. And so one of the recommendations, I believe, that had come up in the land access breakout group was around basically translating what Irene and Dorian, you were just talking about, into how does that affect how the state is giving money to these nonprofits for conservation easements. And so as we think about recommendations, I think that's the kind of the level of detail that you could get to. And some of what was shared in that breakout group was, okay, how can we limit or set up certain parameters around when there is money for acquiring conservation easement? What is that guidance, basically, that those recipients of the money need to fund? And like you just said, oftentimes that's land trusts or other nonprofits. So if you have ideas about that right now too, that would be worth sharing. And also just to say that that's in the draft right now.
Thank you, Tessa. Yeah, I think I missed that meeting, but it's all very interesting. So I need to study the material. But I'm wondering if even more vetting. I mean, I'm imagining that special interest groups or corporations could just immediately, create a nonprofit and sort of control a lot of these land easements in some manner, right? So I wonder if more vetting, in a sense, is, I guess, a part of what Dorian is saying, right?
Yeah, and vetting for what? What would the question, what would the criteria be?
How long have they existed?
Mhm.
Perhaps, more
For community connections, I know, just thinking about another, state program model, sometimes there's required connections to the community or required consultation. So those are certain things that could be built into funds and grant programs as well. One of they existed.
Yeah, so that makes me think of some of these other recommendations that were proposed. The first being to kind of develop a training program for land trusts on how to develop better and more effective easements. And then also kind of advance their cultural competency, particularly regarding tribal nations. And also perhaps creating a land trust accreditation process to kind of develop that education and create mechanisms for evaluating kind of those best practices, Dorian, that you were talking about. So curious how you guys feel about these recommendations in this language as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, I love that idea. I love the idea of like I think as you know, like if the Department of Conservation is having grants or funding available for easements, that sort of be in between, right? Like subject to being able to receive grants, there should be, I think, a certain either yeah, a certain competency that a land trust should be able to have, or like the ability to demonstrate that the right people are going to be at the table as that easement is being drafted. Um, the Accreditation Commission, I mean, yeah, I can go either way with that. I know there's already the Land Trust Accreditation Commission nationally, and that's one of the biggest ones. But I think that one's more focused on like how to create financially sound land trusts in general, and it has best practices of their own. So I would just, I think, ask that if we created an accreditation commission, that it would be based less on like, how to make sure that easements give people the right tax incentives, versus like how to make sure that Yeah, more in the cultural competency realm of it, or cultural humility realm of it.
Yeah, that's helpful note.
I wonder if we could just add and equity at the end to that.
Yeah,
Really good, yeah.
great.
And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be asking the land trust accreditation. Oh, I guess you'd have the semicolon there. Okay, cool. I guess I was just thinking of the accreditation commission, the separate one that we were to
Right,
recommend be created. Okay, cool. Not for us to be like, hey, national, I mean, they're
right,
doing a great job in their capacity, so I would.
right. Great. I'm gonna look at some of the other. So I might jump back to these and see if there's any thoughts or feedback on these recommendations. I'm thinking more here to kind of the perhaps goal of conserving more agricultural land, if that was a goal that wanted to be advanced, perhaps using this mechanism of this first recommendation, seeing if that might be effective. And the second, kind of referring to that constraints that easements can impose on landowners and their ability to live on and make a living on the land. See if you guys have any ideas here. And I think maybe a more specific question, particularly regarding the first bullet, would be what does that support look like? Is it perhaps associated with that separate California commission that focuses on cultural competency, but also focuses on like how to do buy, protect, sell? Or is it other forms of training? Is it perhaps financial support? What might that look like?
Yeah, definitely. I think land trusts that engage in buy, protect, sell. I mean, for sure, the protect piece is stamping the easement on it. So I think being able to have that accreditation piece be related to them would be great, especially because if the easement is being stamped and it's being sold to somebody else. Whoever the groups are involved in that discussion, they need to make sure that even if the land doesn't go to their hands, it's being stewarded in a way that is reflective of the way they want to see it be stewarded or allows them to engage in the land still, even if the land is sold. I um I think the Buy Protect Sell is a great program, but I'm also just thinking on the horizon of like it still presents a substantial challenge when it comes to selling because land prices are still exorbitant, even with the even with an easement stamped on it. And so I don't want to diminish the great work that's gone in creating a program like this, but I do want to just be cognizant of the fact that even with a buy protect sell, land is very expensive, and so I want to work on how do we even make that more accessible.
Apologies for the fire truck. Yeah, and I think maybe the second bullet point really going towards that idea of needing the right people at the table when those easements are created. right?
Yes. Yeah. And then I have one more thing that's related. I'm cautious that it won't take us into a tangent, but it because it's not directly something we've discussed here, but I think we've brought up the idea of like public lands in general. Okay, so I'm gonna sort of paint the picture a little bit. Um, Generally, conservation land trusts, for the most part, don't hold title to land. They hold easements, right? That's most of what they do. And again, I mentioned because holding title to land can be expensive. And so a lot of conservation land trusts, if they want to remain nimble enough to be able to do the work they're doing, they want to focus on holding easements versus land. One of the challenges of that, of course, is that, in this sell part of Buy Protect Sell, if you're selling the land, you're not having it in community control per se, only as far as like the community control piece that remains with it is the easement that's stamped on it. That's really the only relationship that remains after it. I'm thinking of like what are also solutions that we can create that when it comes to selling or placing the land after it's been protected in another vehicle that maybe isn't a private vehicle by a private landowner, but maybe there's a possibility for it to be held publicly. And so this comes to the conversation that we've been having of like, how do we increase public lands for public access? And so I'm thinking, especially like the Department of Conservation has a map, that shows the farmland of statewide. I can't remember the exact title, but statewide significance, statewide importance. I think those are land, for example, that could benefit from something like a Buy Protect Sell program, where they get bought, protected, and then if not sold to private individuals, are possibly put in either public control so that they're able to remain accessible. And maybe, the easement at this point becomes overkill, but this is just something that I'm thinking of is like, as again, I mentioned earlier, right? This sell piece still kind of troubles me because land is still expensive. So I'm thinking of like, instead of selling, what would it be to put in a vehicle where it becomes public land that is publicly accessible?
Mhm.
And the easement is maybe something that's helped by like a tribal nation so that it's both able to be productive agricultural lands, but it's productive agricultural lands that are reflective of the stewardship of the tribal land that they sit on. Yeah. So I hope that wasn't too much of a
Great.
tangent, but I'm just thinking of that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that, Dorian. Caleb, do you have any response? I want to let you lead here.
No, please go
I'm
ahead.
still taking notes. Okay. First, I'm curious if there are examples of that you're aware of, Dorian. Has that happened? Because we definitely want to look into that, if so.
Where land is being held publicly.
Well, where it's like bought, protect, and then transitioned into a public entity.
Protected. I don't know any off the top of my head, but yeah, I mean, I imagine, maybe like some of the ag parks. I actually wouldn't know immediately, but I know some folks work with people that work there, like the Sinol Ag Park.
Yeah.
That might be something in that case where I think it's technically public land.
Yeah, and but
Yeah.
rented to okay. No, that's great. Thank you for outlining that because we'll definitely look into how we might develop recommendations around that or think about that a bit more. And yeah, there's a lot we could look at with it. Like you said, is the conservation easement even necessary at that point if it's going into public hands under specific parameters? That might be enough. And I will note, I mean, we should have this conversation here to the extent that you all want to. And it happens that public lands and some of these other topics are being addressed in the LA3 subcommittee. So it'll all collide again in the February quarterly meeting, but just to let you know.
Cool. Wow, they're doing a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so is there anything else to say about that model? Because I hear you like looking at potentially alternative approaches to just putting the land back on the market in these models that are kind of new and developing, getting more land into public hands and keeping it public. Any other details, just so we can make sure to take those back and look at models?
I mean, to the sell piece, if it's going to go back to private, to sort of a private buyer, I think I don't know the limitations of this, but even seeing if it's, I guess I'm cautious to bring this recommendation, but it would be nice for like a nonprofit or a community-based organization to be able to hold it and the state be able to provide funds for the price to go down even lower. To encourage sort of social forms of land stewardship versus like, you know, I just my worst my worst fear is that this Buy Protect Sell program just makes it more affordable for, like someone who wants an estate, to be able to just buy the land and doesn't really want to use it for, the social purpose of providing food for the community.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's kind of what you were getting at earlier, Irene. Yep, so controls, yeah, and then land market interventions is another, topic of the LA3. So I feel like that the thinking around those interventions right now also relates to the tensions that you're pointing to. So these are really good details to include in that as well.
Cool.
That makes me think a bit about these recommendations as well. I know slightly different maybe, but this is kind of our last set of draft recommendations for the easements and covenants, and kind of curious what you think about them, kind of in relation to the conversation we've been having.
Yeah, these are actually great. I guess I would want to define what a qualified agricultural producer is, and that is maybe a discussion we can have.
Yeah, do you have any initial ideas?
From my work, I always want to focus on, I think, socially oriented and like cooperatively oriented producers, but I know that that's not going to be reflective of maybe other task force members, so who work with, I think, like solo entrepreneurs, that maybe are like first generation farmers or meet the definition of like socially disadvantaged farmer rancher as like established by the California Farm Equity Act. So I think there's that, right? There's that threshold that we're working on the SDFR, but I would want to push that they're actually socially oriented in the sense that yeah, and that's a conversation I think that I would want to have more in depth.
Even the term socially oriented, I'm not sure it's been exactly put like that in our meetings, but that feels worth describing and necessary to describe. So Dorian, you can share, your definition now if you'd like, or we can bring that term into the next meeting.
Yeah, and I think maybe this is a place where I haven't really had the time to I wouldn't say problematize, maybe problematize the frame. But I think we a lot of us work with like, individual entrepreneurs. I think we're very much focused on on the single farmer. And I kind of brought this a little bit problematize it a little bit in the last presentation that I gave, thinking about, like what does it mean to think of like the sole proprietor, the sort of the yeoman farmer, and like what does it actually think? What does it actually feel, or how does it differ to think of a farmer who orients themselves, and this is where I use the term agroecology, but like orients themselves to not think of their farm as like uh, a closed off site of production, but think of themselves nested into a larger ecosystem. And that is both ecologically, but also socially, in the way that maybe they're wanting to share markets and resources um, with other people.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Great.
And I mean, yeah, maybe Irene could speak to this because I know that y'all did a paper on, like on cooperatives, and like sort of thinking about cooperatives in the work that you all do. So, not to put you on the spot, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about, right? Is like how do we harness the power of people working together versus like making sure that like each person works on their own.
Yeah, no, I like that, Dorian. And it just is making me think, but if I have anything else to add, but definitely, I think those are great ideas.
And I think in that sense, that also solves for the idea of like creating an agricultural legacy of like um, creating farmers that can steward land, that will steward land for future generations. Because at the end of the day, like the easement can protect the activities that can happen on the land in a buy, protect, sell program if they're sold to like an individual farmer, for example. But we can't really predict what their successors will do with the land, essentially. And I think that's also another discussion to have, right? Is like we're setting up this generation of farmers to have accessible land, but how are we also ensuring that the generation after that has access to land, and that we're not just kicking the can down the road?
Great, well, that feels like a lot of extra detail and kind of really good lenses to apply to these two recommendations up on the screen. So I think we can probably develop these two recommendations a bit further before February, share them back.
Yeah. Before I move on, are there any further thoughts on kind of easements and covenants generally? Has any further questions? Okay.
I'm wondering, could we add the cooperative, at least the idea of the cooperatives being considered qualified ag producers? Okay.
I'm sorry, that they're considered what?
Just what Dorian was mentioning, but maybe it already sort of includes the cooperative ag producers.
Within that definition of qualified ag producer, is that what you're getting at? Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. There you go.
Great. Again, happy to jump back and always here for further feedback. But kind of with the last couple of minutes that we have, would like to again shift gears again to kind of one more specific recommendation. And Dorian, this was one that you proposed in the working group document. Although perhaps not combining urban growth boundaries and green belts, but something that I think would be valuable for the subcommittee to kind of think through together regarding urban sprawl and the preservation of agricultural land. Kind of what recommendations this task force might want to make regarding kind of constraining urban sprawl and how urban growth boundaries and green belts might fit into that. So Dorian, I don't know if you want to expand on any of these languages or ideas initially, not to put you on the spot, but I know that this was something that you wrote down.
Sure. So I think I was thinking about this as some of the initial topics that were identified for this LUG subcommittee came out, and one of them was related to urban agriculture and the sort of tension between urban agriculture being able to be fully affected in an urban setting. And then I think, of course, the sort of the ever-present need for more housing for farms and for farm workers in general, and just for for the agricultural labor force. And I think I wanted to find a way to imagine, and again, this is also in general, it fits into the idea that right, sovereignty isn't just access to the land, but it's actually being able to have the resource infrastructure to be able to operate effectively. And so I'm thinking of like, how do we create urban and rural environments to collaborate a little better so that housing can be provided more effectively in urban places, and then rural land, doesn't have to be overstrained with like a lot of the zoning problems that we're having to address with it, so that it can accommodate housing because of the fact that urban land can't accommodate housing, right? So a lot of the reason that we see a lot of folks living out, I mean, beyond what we call like the urban wildlife interface is a lot of urban price out, and so like the idea is creating more affordable urban environments so that people can live in urban environments that are better equipped with resources for people to live in them, better, but then also be able to have the land for people to farm on outside of the urban areas. And so this is kind of like a clean picture, right, of like what, like people should live in cities and farm in the country, and I mean, it's not it's not as clean as that, of course, right? Like, it's not like a city simulator where we're just like building the perfect city, but I think there is something to say there about using existing resources that exist within urban communities to reduce the strain on what rural communities need to be able to be effective. Yeah, and so I'm just thinking of that. I'm just like, a lot of the reasons why people want to be able to farm or live where they're farm is because there's actually no integrated way for them to live in an urban area and then be able to farm, right? Like there's no way to split that, so they want to be able to do both. And so what ends up happening is like low intensity sprawl building that is actually taking up a lot of farm. I mean, I see this in Sonoma County, right? There's like a lot of like large lot sort of like ownership of homes that are fragmented, for the sake of living, but then they take away, productive agricultural land. Sorry, that felt really rambly, but it's a little bit of what I was thinking about of just, yeah, how do we create more effective places for living and more effective places for production so that we're not having to do both in one site and effectively like not doing either one or the other, right? Because it's like land that's big enough to live in, but possibly not big enough to farm in, or, land that's big enough to farm in, but doesn't necessarily have the accommodations to live in.
Right. That's helpful. Thanks for walking us through that thought process. And that makes me wonder, the kind of recommendation that's drafted suggests urban growth boundaries and green belts, but that might not be quite addressing the kind of need that you've identified of kind of rather just kind of drawing a sharp line between urban and rural environments. Do you think that, I guess, how do you think that urban growth boundaries or green belts can help with this, or is there something else that maybe needs to be kind of proposed or thought about? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think also one of the things I addressed is like I feel like a lot, and I've noticed this in a lot of the work that I've done, but a lot of the reason why urban farms pop up is because there is that urban disinvestment and people having access to um, access to either green spaces or to like urban farm or just farming space in general, right? And so what ends up doing is that creates a conflict between should we have an urban farm here or should we have affordable housing? And it puts them at ends with each other. I think we have to think bigger, right? So we have to be able to think of like, what if we just have cities that are more affordable, and instead of having to have an urban farm in an empty lot, we actually have a sort of an infrastructure that allows for people to live in cities and then go out into the country and be able to farm. Um, Sorry, I'm being redundant. I was getting to my point, but I think there's something there about being able to make the city more affordable so that it does, yeah. I think my point along that line was like maybe like de-emphasizing the need for urban farms and actually emphasizing the need for better urban infrastructures that allow access to rural areas for farming.
Mm.
And so that means like having an affordable urban areas, but also the ability to be able to go out, and this kind of even goes in line with like the initiatives that have been brought up by the state, to what does it make green space accessible within 5 minutes from someone, or I forget what it is, but it's like, what have we thought of that as far as like urban, or as far as agriculture goes as well?
Mhm. Mhm.
That's helpful. Thank you. For kind of wrapping up, because we are kind of getting towards the noon hour, just wanted to see if there's any other input or feedback that would like to be provided on kind of any of this discussion we had today, including this most recent one on kind of the urban rural interface, but also easements and covenants and the sovereignty definition. Just want to pause for a minute to see if there's any further ideas, thoughts, or feedback.
I'm still just thinking on this last part of what Dorian was mentioning, and it really makes sense. And like I feel like maybe you're even describing it as like urban farms are more like an emergency type of response, right? And because of that less and less lack of access to real ag land or close by. Um, anyway, just wanted to, yeah, show appreciation for those comments because it makes sense. I haven't thought of it that way, that we're creating the problem, obviously, and terms of developments and what's being allowed, right? As I know here, like even in Sacramento, YOLO, you used to just have a 5-minute drive and it's all ag land now. It's the cities are getting denser and denser, and it just blurs the lines of what is urban and not urban. Yeah, a lot more. Obviously, that's the same case everywhere, right? But I'm seeing it here. I've been asked to use my backyard for an urban farm. Anyways, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for reflecting that. You know, and I love urban farms. I mean, I learned my first learning experience was in an urban farm, so no, you know, no shades at urban farms, but I do think, yeah, a lot of the way that we think about urban farms as a solution really takes us away from thinking at a larger ecosystem level. Like, actually, how are we orienting ourselves to agricultural land at large in the way that we develop ourselves, like in urban areas? I just wanted to say the initiative that I was talking about is the Outdoors for All initiative by the CNRA. I think that's the one. And so I'm just thinking of that, you know, of like their initiative is like, I think like, yeah, people should have access to the outdoors by I don't know how many I think it's like 5 minutes or something, but thinking of something like that.
Yeah.
And Dorian,
Well,
a program like that, sorry, Caleb, really
yeah,
quickly. If we're thinking about that model that you just mentioned, everyone should have access to agriculture within 5 minutes, or what is the kind of parallel that you're thinking of? Is it urban ag?
I think anyone who's in the agricultural industry should have access to their place of work within, and maybe it'll be larger than that, you know, but I'm thinking of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah, we have just a couple more minutes. Do you want me to wrap up, Caleb, or do you have any final questions?
I think I don't have any final questions. I'll pass it to you to do the kind of official wrap up, but I just want to say thank you for kind of walking through these ideas and language with us. I know that can be a bit hard with such a small group, but it was really valuable, and so just wanted to express appreciation for the time and effort that went into these last 2 hours.
Yeah, definitely echo that. I don't know, do you want to start sharing slides again, Caleb, or you could just go to the next slide, either way.
Yeah, 1 second. Go. Perhaps. Let's do this. Oh,
Great. That's okay. So, I mean, essentially just the wrap up that you all are used to. We have a couple of different action items. One is bringing the conversation around cultural fire back to SNCR and thinking through how we might create a working group on that topic, potentially with you, Dorian, and then someone else from that subcommittee. We had a really good conversation on the definition of sovereignty, so we're gonna incorporate what we heard, review that with Emily, I think before the February meeting, if we can get a time on the calendar, and then we'll bring that back to the February meeting for the full task force discussion. And then same model for all of the other ideas that Caleb brought forth today. So we'll kind of summarize what we heard from you all, incorporate that those perspectives and the additional language into the initial draft of recommendations that we'll be discussing in February. I think I've been taking notes with just two of us. It's a little hard to scan through. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, but we will go back and make sure there weren't any other action items that I might be missing. As far as the next meeting goes, I think, let's see. I think we will probably request to schedule the next meeting for sometime after the quarterly meeting in February. So the next meeting of this subcommittee might be mid-March, more or less. I think if you just look out for an email from Megan to request your calendars, or she may already have that information. Just look out for that. We are going to try to schedule a bit further in advance, so that email will probably come within the next week or so. And then, as usual, we have meeting notes that will go up on, or the reporting, excuse me, and the summary will go up on the website. And you can go to the next slide. I'm realizing, yeah, general public comment. I don't see any online. If there's anyone from the public who wants to make a comment, now would be the time. You can go to the next slide, Caleb. And seeing none, we can move on. Just a quick reminder of upcoming meetings. 3 subcommittee meetings, and then February 12th and 13th, our next quarterly meeting in Coachella. That will be in person and also online. And I think that takes us to the end here. All right, Dorian and Irene, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for sharing all your ideas. And we will be in touch. And thank you to the members of the public who are here with us in person or virtually online.
Thank you.
Okay, have